Okay, the warm-cool color study, where you were to select colors from your color grid exercise and create a hopefully dynamic composition that reflected your preferred sector of the design industry, whether it was logo design or web design, illustration. So we want to look at how the color is used and what it does. And I'll also talk about some design and compositional things as well. Let's go ahead and start with this. So here we have two options, not one. So I'll talk more about this first simply because it tends to be a stronger design overall in the way things are locked up. First of all, value is the main reason for the separation of the lockup from the background. And the color is darker, the chromatic color is darker than the background. These would actually better be presented on a gray background. The background appears a little warm, so the background is going to advance visually and help flatten the space. So we're not going to get a lot of color depth. The intense color on the orange will also advance, so that's going to come more forward visually. It'll be a closer visual plane than the background, which is a lighter, warm, kind of orange, peachy color. At least that's how it's reading on my screen. The type itself, the letter forms themselves, are a yellow, and so they're not knocked out white, so there's kind of an interesting little vintage feel going on. If you notice this division right here between the orange and the blue, there seems to be a kind of a buzz or a visual vibration, and that is the simultaneous contrast, which is increased with saturated color and decreased with less saturated color. And where you have greater value contrast, you don't notice it as much, but the value difference between the orange and the blue is minimal. The orange is slightly darker than the blue. Because of that lack of value contrast, we're getting a vibration that's actually uncomfortable to look at, but that's the nature of color. So we can use that visual vibration, that simultaneous contrast, the contrast of hue and saturation and value all working together to create visual excitement within a design, or to pacify, to create something that's much more calm. The dark gray here on the drop shadow is neutral. It's value only. It is separating from the background, and it serves to help separate the lockup from the overall background. So in terms of warm-cool difference, the warm color will advance, especially at full saturation. The blue will recede, although it will advance a little bit over a desaturated background color. A couple of things here design-wise. The vertical positioning of color, there's less room at the top than there is at the bottom, so it kind of feels squeezed to the top of the red shape. So it kind of feels squeezed toward the top of the red shape. Letter spacing looks okay. Could be a little bit of tweaking here and there. In terms of how the color is used, the color contrast, the warm-cool, is mainly working between the orange and the blue. And then everything else is value and temperature. And with this one, I'll just talk about this one a bit. We're going from a warmer color into cooler. So we go from a warm red into a cooler red, into the violet and the blue violet, and then immediately out into a shaded red, kind of red-orange. And then the type below. In this lockup, the color serves to, because it's all the same value or close in value, everything participates equally in separating from the background. The background's a lot lighter in value. The chromatic colors, the more saturated colors, are darker in value, so that's the immediate separation. Remember that value contrast is the chief reason, the main way we differentiate form from space. We go from warm to cool, and so we have a sense of, since warm colors advance, the ends of the word actually advance to a greater degree than the cool. The cool is going to recede, so we're going to notice the ends of the word first before we're going to notice the middle. And it's kind of a split-second thing, but that's the way it is. So in terms of the warm-cool contrast, we're not getting a really strong use of the contrast because of how the color's blending. So it's not like we have the warm color laid on top of the cool to kind of create more planar depth, more visual planes within the design, nor are we flattening the space by using a warm background and then cool for the figure. The dynamic of color between the temperature changes, the temperature contrasts, is pretty much mitigated because of the choice of color distribution. Just design-wise, this is much more immediate and interesting than this. This has a little bit of spatial issue right there. Probably would not have chosen to use the serif typeface with the kind of hand script idea. I think this could have been a different choice altogether for a little more impact. The proportions of the letter forms themselves seem to work okay in terms of the height and the alignment and everything, and the way this wraps and starts framing this is really nice. So here we have an illustration, and definitely warm cool, and it appears to be orange blue and then red and a blue green, maybe red orange and a blue green. So the way this is set up, it is somewhat it is somewhat spatial, but at the same time space flattens. And I'll talk about other reasons why the space flattens than color. And that would relate to certain things from fundamentals of two-dimensional design and design principles and elements altogether. Again, the main issue here is value. And so the darker colors tend to advance where the lighter colors juxtapose. We see this edge very strongly, and we see this edge and this edge. Those are our first reads because of the value contrast. This is a second read along here because of how the darkness of the blue-green, it's reading as blue-green on my screen, versus the tinted red-orange. Everything else, if you squint, we kind of lose boundaries. Things get fuzzy. The hair and the eyeglasses, the sunglasses come forward. The feet come forward again because of value contrast. So the first read to separate figure from ground is the value contrast issue. The warm cool, the hair is warm, the color of the sweater is warm. So those advance because of saturation and warmth versus the coolness of the background. Here we're advancing not because of temperature, we're advancing because of value. So the blue being cooler is basically going to try to sit behind on a farther visual plane than the tinted red-orange, but because of value it advances forward. And then the feet, because they're lighter, again advance forward. They are barely, and the skin tones are really neutral, and they're actually looking, see what they are. Find my eyedropper tool over here. Let's go there, and we've got that. Well, it's actually a neutralization. There's no black, so there's no tone in it. So we have an overall sense because of the juxtaposition of warm cool. We go cool, warm, cool, and then this is warm overall. There is a sense of a kind of a checkerboard idea of light, dark, light, dark, light, dark. That will flatten your space. And that, along with certain design issues in this, are flattening space. So let me show you what those are. And I'm going to come in, I think, with yellow. All right, so the idea of implied line is that there are continuations of edges. And we can use implied line to create visual continuity within a design, to relate edge to edge throughout the design. And it also serves to flatten space. Whenever you have implied line, space is going to be flattened, depending upon what else is going on. There's an implied line. So that's relating this to the inside of her arm. We could complete it if the hair came all the way out to that stopping point. this is an implied line. It coincides with her arm. So those things help to flatten space because we are noticing these alignments within the space, and they contradict any sense of linear perspective. The other thing that's flattening is that this distance from there to there is the same as this distance. So there's no linear perspective. This is actually almost a axonometric drawing. So the laws of diminishment, the way we actually see in our visual field, things that are closer are larger, things that are farther away are smaller. So this is the basis for linear perspective drawing system, and also just for understanding information in our visual field. And so just by virtue of the front edge of this platform being the same distance or length vertically as the back edge as it moves off the picture plane, that in itself serves to flatten, and the space becomes very geometric. It becomes very interesting and intriguing. The warm-cool separation works really well. In other words, the warm color advancing here works well against the cool background. It reverses here so that this face of the platform is advancing ahead of the jeans. Okay, this is a warm cool. We've got a lot of cool blue, violet, and violet down in the lower half, and also heavier value, darker value, increased value. So there's greater weight in the bottom half of the ellipse, and we do have some weight up here. The blues here are very warm. This is a cyan, looks like it's moving into a probably a dark tone or a shade, and then this is close to black. And then the warmer colors are here. This is actually warmer than this. The Ocean Avenue stands out and separates from the background. Everything separates from the white ground due to value contrast. It's not necessarily hue contrast because the background in everything is white. So white has no temperature. It is a true neutral, just like black and true grays have no temperature. They are true neutrals. So without chroma, they cannot have temperature. The colors are not juxtaposed against each other. In other words, there's nothing that is contiguous. There is white that separates everything. The only place we really have a contiguous color is right here and then right in here. And so the blue-violet against the darker, this is going to appear lighter. This will appear darker. And it'll lighten up down here. Actually, it'll appear a lot darker because we're seeing against the white. And this will appear darker because it's against the white. Appears darker than it actually is against the white. So anything against white is going to appear darker. Anything on top of black is going to appear lighter. Those are the relative value contrasts. So the warmth is kind of in the center, and that's what is going to capture our attention. Design-wise, there's a couple things that could be tweaked. I think where this hand script is positioned and how it relates to Ocean and Avenue, and how it relates to this implied line here, this completion of that ellipse. This isn't working. It feels off. This works better. It has a better alignment. It has a better understanding of being kind of on the same implied line as Ocean. And if we look at where this is, it doesn't really have a good following. Remember how we read Gutenberg principle? We read from upper left to lower right. So the placement of Ocean and then having to jog up here, you're asking the eye to go all over the place. So we come in here, and then instead of doing this, which is a natural follow-through, you're asking the reader to do this and jump up and down. And that doesn't follow in a start to linear pattern, linear fashion, following the Gutenberg principle, which is we will enter, because we read language in English from upper left to lower right, It doesn't follow. It doesn't help the reader. It doesn't help the viewer. It doesn't help the user understand and get the idea quickly. And with graphic design, you have to be real strategic. You have to be real specific and deliberate about how you're placing things. You can't just place things because of aesthetics. You have to place things because of communication and messaging and aesthetics. So it's a blend. This understanding actually comes out of the Bauhaus School, which just celebrated its 100th anniversary within the past 12 months. And the way we teach design these days, well, actually, if we teach it with human-centeredness in mind, we will take a lot of cues from the Bauhaus. I, as an instructor and a designer first and then instructor, was trained in those methodologies very specifically. They're what I teach. They're my approach. Everything relates to how people see and understand their visual field. We take in probably 90% of information every single day visually. And its color, its value, its composition, its proportion, its scale, it's all those design fundamental principles that you learn in the Fundamentals of Design class, coupled with meaning and relevance and what is it, and identification and appeal. You have to think about how people are going to receive and understand what you're designing, especially as graphic designers, because you're visual communicators. You're using the form language of aesthetic principles and elements to communicate. And you do this on behalf of clients or your employer. And so you want to get it right. So in order to communicate to human beings, you have to communicate so that they understand, which means you need to understand how we understand. We don't do this naturally when we read. We have to be forced into it. So unless there's a really good reason to jump and to jump Ocean Avenue in this way, it's not a good idea. And so what's the purpose? What are we trying to do? And how do we want this to read? And that's a design problem that as a designer you have to solve, because you can't just use the aesthetic principles without using the universal design principles like the Gutenberg principle, because that's the way we see things. That's the way we understand. In some sense, there is a lower left to upper right movement, which is preferred, but not in this case, because we're reading words. We're reading type. So this has to be the first thing we see. This needs to be aligned with this in some way. And then we drop to here and go out. And this is additional to the color issues that I've already addressed for the purposes of making better design, more effective design, of using these color principles and design principles in the best way possible to communicate clearly, because design is not about interpretation. We are not artists. We are designers, and there's a different mindset. There's a different purpose for what we do. And so we always have to keep the end user in mind, and the end user is always going to be a human being who sees things exactly the way we see them, because we are all human. It's kind of like we all breathe the same. We all see color wavelength frequencies the same, with minor variations. So in general, keep it human-centered. Always keep the reader in mind. What is the most obvious and effective way to lay out your design so that the communication is quick and easy, and it can make the impact and get the results that are being asked for. So let's look at this one. This is an illustration, and it's kind of an architectural, kind of visual development type of animation illustration. It has some fun stuff. It's telling a very interesting story. The perspective is all wanky, but still sort of there. It has a fun idea. This uses, obviously, the orange and the blue-green. So we have the saturated orange, we have the tint of orange, and then we have the blue-green, which is tinted and then shaded. And there's a strong value separation. About 50% of the overall space is the darker value, 50% is the lighter value, so it's got a good value balance there. And the values here are light enough that they separate from the background, and here they're dark enough that they separate from the background. These little elements back here kind of get lost, and I don't know that they're necessary, or they could be beefed up just a little more, keep the same value contrast, but they're kind of so faint they almost look like they don't belong. So either make them a little more definitive, give them a little stronger role, but keep them in the background because they kind of catch the eye and distract from what's going on here. The main element, the detail, is framed by a lot of negative space, so the eye is going to explore overall in here. The warmth is juxtaposed or contrasted with the cool, so the warm colors advance, the cool colors recede, so we do get a sense of planar depth. And this is a really good use of warm-cool contrast because it is using the color to create the depth, to help tell the story, to bring focus and attention to the main elements and the heroes within the overall design. So good value contrast, good use of the warm cool, the selection of color. It has an overall warm tonality. All the colors, even the blue-green, the orange, they're all what we'll call warm. They're yellow-based rather than blue-based within each of their hue families. So there's a blending together. It has almost a little bit of a retro feel, but not quite. It works really well in applying color to help promote and further the narrative.